Welcome, everybody, to the Dr. Leadership Lounge, where we have conversations with business leaders from all walks of life about how and why they are successful. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Another edition of the Leadership Lounge. Today, we're continuing with part two with retired Naval Commander Kirk Lippold, the commander of the USS Cole, which was attacked by Al-Qaeda on October 12th of 2000 in the Aden port in Yemen. And today, we're going to finish off the conversation by going into that attack and his book, Front Burner, that really talks about it and some of the things that happened right after the attack, because it's just an amazing story. But the last episode, we got ramped up through his career and how he was deployed several times, went through a lot of things, close calls with Beirut, and the terrorism that started back in the 80s, and even a little bit before that. You really go back to Iran and the hostage crisis, and that's when things really started to percolate. But Commander Kirk, thank you again. Welcome back. Appreciate your service to this country and greatly enjoyed the first part of this endeavor we're on. But let's talk a little bit about, kind of take us through the fruitful days there, or the fateful days. It wasn't fruitful, misspoke. The fateful day there in the port, and just kind of walk us through that story. And then we'll kind of get into, what transpired after that. I wanted to get into, when you were visiting the CIA and when, as you progressed into then 9/11. But tell us a little bit about, so the USS Cole, you did a year worth of seaworthiness getting it ready, and then you were deployed, and just kind of walk us through this thing as it happened.
Command of the ship at the end of June in 2000. Being part of the George Washington Aircraft Carrier Battle Group, we'd spent a year getting the ship, getting the whole battle group ready for deployment to the Middle East. Mm-hmm. We knew that USS Cole's primary mission was going to be what we call visit, board, search, and seizure. We were going to be enforcing United Nations sanctions against the country of Iraq in the North Arabian Gulf. But a few months before we deployed, because of rotation schedules in and out of the Middle East, coupled with the fact that USS Cole had literally the best Tomahawk team on the East Coast, when we did our ammunition unload, I was actually carrying double the normal load of Tomahawks on board the ship. And while I can't get into numbers, that was pretty significant for how we were going to do things. But because of rotation schedules, the battle group would actually deploy 6 weeks before we would. So while the George Washington and all the ships, except for one guided missile frigate that would stay with me, they would deploy to the Middle East. We held back and actually would deploy on the 8th of August in 2000. And we would go across, and where the George Washington had gone directly into the Middle East, USS Cole had the opportunity to make several port visits because of the performance of the ship and the crew. What do you want for port visits? And I was granted 4 for 4 for the requests.
Excellent.
So we made port visits to great ports like Barcelona, Spain,
beautiful,
Villafranche, France, Valletta, Malta, Koper, Slovenia, and the crew just had a wonderful time there.
Wonderful.
Just a great opportunity to,
see the world.
Be that ambassador, see the world. They saw bullfights. They saw the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower, St. Paul's Shipwreck Cathedral. They went to Lake Bled when we were in Slovenia. They took bus rides across the border into Italy and saw Venice. So just a wonderful opportunity. But that day would come when it's time to buckle down and focus, because now we're headed to the Middle East.
Get back to work.
During that time frame, USS George Washington had come back into the Mediterranean from the Middle East. We would meet up with them. We would exchange duties. Then we would proceed across the Eastern Mediterranean. We would be the only Navy ship going at that time. The guided missile frigate that was with us was going to follow about 2 weeks later. But we would be the only military ship in a 14-ship convoy going through the Suez Canal on the 9th of October. So we would proceed through the Suez Canal, come out the bottom end, but we would end up going down the Red Sea through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. And at that point in time, we had gone from a Navy of around 4,000 ships in World War II to just shy of 600 ships at the height of the Reagan buildup in the mid-1980s, taking on the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And now we were down to a Navy of 315 ships, and there wasn't an oiler within 1,000 miles of us. So knowing our ship situation, the Department of Defense and the Navy had negotiated fuel contracts at 2 points that were about at the halfway point. One was in Aden, Yemen, which sits at the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and the other sits right up in the pocket just above the Horn of Africa in Djibouti. Djibouti at the time was considered a higher threat port for terrorists. So we would actually be ordered into Aden, Yemen. And we arrived off the port at about 2:30 in the morning. We just set up a small box and steamed back and forth off the port. And the next morning, we would contact the Port Authority. 2 tugs would come out and meet us. We would go up into the harbor itself, which was shaped like a huge bowl, and we would be in the middle and then going to the eastern side. When we got into that area, I made my first force protection decision, turned the ship around, and we would be moored to a pier out in the middle of the harbor. And that was the refueling pier, pretty standard. We would actually be the 27th ship that would pay a call to Aden, Yemen. It had become a very reliable, very
refueling spot.
Brief stop for fuel. And so everything was routine. We were moored next to the pier around 9:30. We shut down the 4 main engines that power the 2 shafts. We left 2 of our 3 gas turbine generators providing power to the ship. We began the import refueling checklist, all the normal routine things that would go on. And about 10 o'clock that morning, my main propulsion assistant came up, said, "Captain, the checklist is complete. The valves are aligned. Chief engineer's doing her checks. I know you want to get out of here sooner. So if you would just bottom line the checklist, I can take it down and wait. And when the engineer's done, she signs off and we start pumping fuel and we'll be ahead of schedule." Yeah, I'm one of those guys that, hey, you have checklists for a reason. First and foremost, it's for safety of personnel and safety of equipment. And we also do it because it's just shown that when you try to take shortcuts in those kind of processes,
you can't do it, right?
It just, eventually it is going to catch up with you. And it doesn't matter whether you're flying airplanes or driving ships or refueling them, you have to do it right and you do it by the book. And this was a young, talented officer. He had 13 years of experience under his belt, a great mentor to my young junior officers. But I looked at him and said, take the checklist down, wait for the chief engineer. When she's done, bring it back up to me. Of course, being a good prior enlisted sailor, he was expressing his complete and total satisfaction with my logic as he's walking out of the cabin, which I will not repeat for your listeners, but they can imagine it. All good-natured. But
absolutely.
He understood.
He got dressed down a little bit there. Yeah, do it right or don't do it at all.
And at about 30 minutes later, 10:30 that morning, the chief engineer came up. I reviewed the list, checked the valve alignments. They were all signed off. I signed off, and a few minutes later, we started pumping fuel. Now, I had been in touch with the commanding officer who had been in there several weeks before we were scheduled to pull in, and he said, look, the refueling rate's slow. Now, because of our driving across the Eastern Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, all the way down the Red Sea and rounding the corner, we were actually below 50% fuel because we were doing it at almost double the normal transit speed because of those rotation schedules, and we'd been held back for a little bit for operational reasons in the Mediterranean.
Making up time.
So we were going to be taking on, a ship like USS Cole carries a little over 500,000 gallons. So we were going to be taking on 250,000 gallons of fuel. But the refueling rate was only going to be 300 to 500 gallons an hour. So the reality is we expected to be there at least 6 to 8 hours, which was what was driving the MPA or main propulsion assistance thought process. The sooner I get started, the sooner I get done. The sooner I get done, the sooner I can get back to sea.
Right.
That's where Navy ships feel safest.
Yep.
So we start pumping the fuel. Great. The clock started. I'm going to be out of here well before sunset this evening, so I've got good visual cues going out of the port when the time comes. And at 10:40, the supply officer came. She made a very generous offer that in addition to refueling the ship, bringing a sewage barge out because our tanks wouldn't last 6 to 8 hours, and taking and filling that honey barge up, and then also taking fresh water from the pier because we didn't want to make it out of the dirty harbor water, even though we could clean it up It's just better to wait.
Yep.
So she also had arranged with the logistics agent in the port, or what we call a husbanding agent, to bring 3 garbage barges out to the ship. And for $150, no questions asked, they would take off all the trash, all the plastic, and all the hazmat. And while I initially kind of resisted it, she would bring the XO up. We'd have a discussion about it. And eventually I relented and said, fine, let's make it go happen. And that's how it came to be that we were going to have these 3 boats come out to the ship to remove all of our trash, all of our plastics, and all of our hazardous material that we can't dump at sea.
Right.
And so that was going fine. But when the executive officer came up and the supply officer went out and the boats were on their way out to come see us and the crew had already staged the trash, that's when the XO informed me that the refueling rate was significantly higher than what we'd anticipated. Instead of that 300 to 500 gallon per minute rate, when the Yemenis opened the valve down on the pier to the hose that came up onto the ship and we opened it up, opened the valve to the tanks up, the refueling rate was actually 2,500 gallons a minute.
Wow.
It was coming on the ship initially so fast that we were overpressurizing the tanks and had to throttle it back down to 2,000 gallons a minute. But at that rate, I could fill the big centerline tanks, the wing tanks, but instead of 6 to 8 hours, I'd be there 2 to 2.5 hours instead. The supply officer was ready to feed the noon meal of chicken fajitas. The XO wanted to tell the crew we were ahead of schedule, let them know that get done because
we're going to be going underway.
Gave us the opportunity. About the time that we finish refueling is going to be about the time that I finish feeding the crew and we can get underway and back out to sea that much earlier. So I said, go make the announcement. I go sit at my desk doing what we all love to do, that never-ending stack of paperwork and bureaucracy.
Yep, happens to the best of us.
And the XO, I hear him make the announcement in the background, and then I go back to work on my paperwork. And as I'm sitting there at 11:18 on that morning, on the 12th of October,
here we go.
There was a thunderous explosion. You could feel all 505 feet and 8,400 tons of guided missile destroyer suddenly and violently was thrust up and to the right toward the refueling pier. I didn't know it, but when we had pulled into about 36 feet of water. The force of that explosion blew a 20-foot wide, 4-foot deep crater under the ship, and the reflecting shock wave lifted USS Cole up an estimated 6 to 8 feet, and we slid back down in the water. But during those split seconds, power failed. The generators were knocked offline. Lights went out. Ceiling tiles popped out. I literally came up in the brace position, grabbing the underside of my desk as I watched everything pop up and slam back down. When the ship stopped moving to a point that I could let go without getting knocked over, I went to the door of my cabin. And as I looked down that darkened passageway or hallway going toward from the starboard side where my cabin was to the port side where the officer's wardroom is, where we eat, I looked down in that dark. There's only 2 emergency lights down the passageway, and I see this gray cloud coming toward the corner around the corner, and it literally washes over me.
Oh,
I could smell the dust. I could smell the fuel, but there was also this acrid metallic tang that settled in the back of my mouth, and I didn't know what it was.
That was the explosives.
Would turn out, at that point in time, though, all I knew is that we had a fuel explosion on the ship.
That's what you're thinking. Yeah, the fueling thing's gone bad.
It's the most logical step.
Right.
And a young officer that was in the stateroom that lived right behind mine, he comes out, grabs the door jamb, looks at me, and using good sailor-like language, he asks me, what the F was that? And then all he says is fuel. And then he does what every single one of these young men and women who serve today do. He turned without saying one more word and headed straight toward the danger into that gray cloud.
Wow.
And at that point, I went and I took one step out of my cabin to follow him and stopped. When I had pulled USS Cole into the port, turned it around, and had moored it starboard side or right side to the pier, if it had been a fuel explosion on the ship or the pier, because of the force of the explosion next to a stationary object, I should have been pushed left and out into the harbor. I'd been thrust up and to the right toward the pier. So right then and there, I knew that we had been attacked because something had come alongside and detonated. And it was at that point that I went back into my cabin, then to the bedroom area, and near the head of my bed on the deck or the floor is the safe where I kept the keys to the weapon systems on the ship. Torpedoes, 5-inch gun, missiles, all those. I kneeled down. It's got one light shining on the dial. I dial it open, reached in. I don't grab a handful of keys. I reached in and pulled out a personal weapon, a Sig Sauer 229 9mm, loaded it, chambered around, decocked it, grabbed 2 clips of ammunition, put them in my pocket, headed out of my cabin, down one deck on the starboard side, out into the passageway, and ran toward the back of the ship. I was stopped at the middle of the ship, and as I'm looking back toward the flight deck, no one is around. The 3-person watch team that was there to oversee all the fuel workers down on the pier, they're gone. The little wooden podium that they used to keep the deck log on,
gone,
has been blown into pieces and is scattered across the deck. The wires that used to form our high-frequency radio antennas are snapped off and draped down, and dirty black water is dripping off of everything. I don't know whether we're going to be boarded. I don't know if there's going to be a follow-on attack. All I know is I'm standing there holding the 9mm, and I said, well, this might be your destiny, but guess what?
I'm going in.
If you go down, you're going to go down fighting for your ship. So I took that deep breath, and you have that singular moment where, you raise your right hand like I did as a young 18-year-old, and you swear that oath to support and defend the Constitution and our way of life in our country. And you know that you're willing to give your life for it. But until a moment like this occurs where you actually, it crystallizes in that moment, you never really grasp what you're about to do.
Was it surreal? Was it surreal to you at that point? Or?
No, it was actually, I was perfectly calm. I was perfectly comfortable with the decision I was making. I knew what might happen, and I just said, well,
let's go.
This may be it.
Wow.
And I took that deep breath, and I headed toward the port side of the ship. And all I could think is, if you see someone that doesn't belong, make them duck first and don't leave an empty round in the...
That's right. Oh, God bless you.
So as I rolled out, headed toward the port side, first person I see is not a terrorist. It is actually my chief's gunner's mate responding to the attack. He's got on his flak vest, his helmet. He's got an M14, and we talked to each other for a few seconds and then walked over to the port side of the ship, leaned over, and that confirmed my worst fears. All the metal is shoved inward. You could see the spray pattern of explosive residue on the side of the ship. Some of the lifelines in that area had been blown clean away and no longer even existed there. And as I glanced up and down the left side of USS Cole, everything that was metal was slightly dished in from the force of the explosion. Man. Everything that was plastic or fiberglass
melted,
covering electronics enclosure or an antenna had either been blown clean off or was crumpled around it.
How big? I know you're going to get to it. How big was the hole that this thing left?
Well, at that time we didn't know. All I could see was kind of the top, maybe 25% of the hole.
Wow.
We just didn't know how big it was. And we actually wouldn't learn until we got it, it's kind of getting ahead of it a little bit, but that's when we get up on the heavy lift ship Blue Marlin.
Yeah.
But as I glance down over the port side again, as you say, how big is that hole? I see something else instead. Alongside the ship are 4 orange rafts. One is sunk in the area of the blast hole. 2 more are deflated, lying alongside the ship, headed back toward the flight deck. But back by the flight deck is a fully inflated orange raft. The first thing that went through my mind was, how did the security team let these rafts get alongside the ship? Yeah. Clearly the first one blew up, and that's what put the hole in the side. The next 2 were probably peppered with shrapnel, which is why they were deflated, and they didn't detonate because the detonators got knocked loose. But the one by the flight deck, if that goes off, it's fully inflated, I'll be in big trouble, because then it will definitely take out the 2 screws that propel the ship, the 2 rudders that steer it, and there'll be no way I can get USS Cole underway. So at that point, all these sailors are coming out from inside of the ship. I made a security decision not knowing the situation. I shoved them all back inside the skin of the ship. And at that point in time, I began to make decisions, and I began to make decisions on the best information I had.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, I put the chief in charge, said, don't allow any more boats alongside. I went up to the bridge, contacted the Yemeni port authorities on a handheld bridge-to-bridge walkie-talkie, told them, don't allow any more. I want no more boats moving in the harbor till we know what's going on, because we didn't know where the attack had come from.
Yep.
Notify local hospitals. They said they had 2, and 3 was send boats out to us to help get the wounded off, because I'm already pushing my timeline out 1 hour, because I'm within the golden hour, and we don't have a doctor aboard. I've got a chief hospital corpsman who's like a physician's assistant, so I've got to get folks off the ship. But at this point in time, USS Cole's in trouble. We are listing over 5.5 degrees to port. We are down 1 degree by the bow. We could literally feel our ship sinking beneath our feet.
Jeepers.
And it was at that point in time that I said, I have to get to the central control station to find out what's going on. So I take a deep breath, leave the operations officer in charge, told him to communicate with the security teams so that they knew these boats coming out to rescue the wounded would come out. I went down in the dark to my cabin, grabbed a flashlight, started walking toward the back end of the ship on the dark, on the starboard side. That's where I got my first piece of good news, because the back 1/3 of the ship has lights on. So right then and there, if I've got lights on, that means I have a generator running. Yep. That means I can get power to pumps. That means I can save the ship.
Wow. Now, was the crew just instantaneously responding? Had all the training paid off just instantaneously? Did you have to reaffirm getting their mind right, or did it just all kick in like you'd trained?
It all kicked in because there was no way to affirm it. And the reason why is the announcing system for the ship, or what we call the 1MC, had failed. The backup system had failed. So there was no way to tell the crew what had happened, where to go, what to do. They fell back on their training.
Just the reflexes
without
kick in.
anyone telling them, they divided into one of 3 groups: damage control to save the ship from sinking, triage to save their shipmates, or security to stop another attack.
Man, that's just incredible. Just continue on. So you see power, and it's not relief at that point, but I suppose that some optimism came into play where, okay, suddenly maybe the fight's a fair fight here because you were blindsided. What's going through your mind at this point?
What I ended up doing is I walked into the mess line and the galley area, and I would actually look down to the devastation in the area of the galley, which bore the brunt of the hit, along with main engine room number 1 right beneath it. I could see out the hole in the side of the ship. Ugh. And at that point in time, I knew I needed to get to the central control station, as I mentioned, because that's co-located with Damage Control Central. So I would actually leave the area there, step out into the starboard side passageway. I'm in the lighted portion now, and that's where I came face to face with an earlier decision, because when the blast hit, the crew had gathered up all their wounded and headed out onto the flight deck to get the fresh air. But what had the captain done? I'd shoved everyone back inside because I didn't know the security situation.
Right.
And now all the way down the lighted portion of the ship at the back end are all the wounded. Broken bones, shrapnel, cuts, scrapes, bruises, shock. And what I ended up doing was I looked at them. I would have given anything to talk to my wounded sailors. 2 to 3 of sailors were working on every one of them to stabilize them and save their lives. But I had to step in between them because my number 1 priority has to be the ship.
Them and save the rest.
If we can't save the ship, nothing else is going to matter.
Yep.
So at that point in time, I walked into the central control station. Everybody is doing exactly what they were supposed to. We had 1 operating generator determining how much power we had, how many pumps we had online. The executive officer is working with the damage control assistant to plot the damage. And at that point, I get to make the best decision of my command tour. I kept my mouth shut because I didn't need to take charge of the situation until I knew everything going on. Waited for about a minute, took the briefings, learned the status of the ship. Once I knew we weren't going to sink, because we'd only lost 2 of the 4 main engineering spaces from flooding, I could turn damage control over to the executive officer. I went up to the middle of the ship. By that point in time, we'd assessed the security situation to be good enough to treat the wounded. I went to the middle of the ship. My chief hospital corpsman was there. We were treating the wounded at that point in time. And the way we would end up having to get them off the ship is we would literally, we're trying to get a metal brow down to the pier, but it's going to take over an hour, and I can't wait. So we would literally lean a ladder up against the side of the ship at a 45-degree angle, and then we would take these sailors that were wounded and strapped into a metal litter.
And then
we tied
slide
2
them
lines
down
to the feet, 2 lines to the head, put them over the side, onto a ladder, down to the pier, and that's where the Yemenis would then take them ashore to the hospitals.
Man. And so you didn't know at this time, but I think it was 17 lost and
Correct.
31 wounded.
By the end of the day, and in fact, it was actually the next morning, we'd get the final count that we had 5 confirmed killed that had been identified. There were 12 missing in the wreckage of the mess line, the galley area, and main engine room number 1. I knew from the dynamics of the blast that they had been killed outright, and that would prove to be true later as they were recovered. So that's where we ended up with our final tally of 17 killed. And then over the next few days, once all the injuries finished manifesting themselves, including ruptured eardrums, that's where we would end up with the 17 wounded.
31 wounded, right? 17.
17 killed, 37 wounded.
37 wounded. Okay, thank you. Ugh.
Yep.
It's terrible.
So, and as a testament to how well the crew did that day, we evacuated 33 wounded off the ship. We did it in 99 minutes. And of
Amazing.
those 33, 32 would survive.
That's absolutely. The training matters,
Oh, absolutely. And, part of it was, again, raising that bar. When we deployed the ship in August, every single crew member was CPR certified.
And it all paid off, for that one event. How many lives did it save? Dozens, I'm sure. Just an amazing testament to preparation, attitude, the ability to perform under pressure. This is the real deal at this point, and it's just amazing to me. So please, continue on. So you now know that you're not going to lose the ship.
Right. So we've got the ship stable. We've got the wounded ashore. We would immediately begin with systems restoration. We would continue that through Friday. We would also begin to see the flow of forces into the region to help us, and that included Mobile Diving Salvage Unit 2, Norfolk Naval Shipyard. There was a very large FBI and Navy Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS contingent.
Yeah.
Those 2 law enforcement groups work together. Because a lot of what you have to remember is I'm 11 months before 9/11. We haven't even thought that a 9/11 could occur. And so this was treated purely as a criminal act, as an international terrorism incident.
They hadn't any idea to tie it all together on this overall scheme and attack process.
No, and we can touch on that later, but we would get a huge flow of forces into the region to begin to help us. But one of the problems that we ran into is on Saturday, the crew was doing a phenomenal job, and we had actually dewatered gotten the floodwaters almost out of one of the engineering spaces. And we had done that by around 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning, when all of a sudden, we don't know whether a bulkhead or gave way or a pipe gave, but suddenly the space reflooded. The pumps couldn't keep up, and we ended up having to seal it off and give it up. I just call it captain's intuition. I just didn't like how things seemed to be developing, and I told the XO at around 2 in the morning, wake the crew up and put them at their general quarters station. And about an hour later, our only operating generator, number 3, quit.
Oh, man.
It turns out that we had lost our ability to remotely monitor fuel. And so, being good engineers, though, hey, that doesn't matter. You open the technical manual, you say, okay, what was the load on the generator? How many kilowatts did we have?
What's the
Given
remaining?
that number of kilowatts, what's the burn rate? Given what the burn rate is, this is how long we can run off the one tank before we shift to the secondary tank and then fill the first one up. Unfortunately, the generator, in fact, had suffered damage and it was burning fuel at a higher rate than we anticipated. What we did was suck the tank dry.
Gotcha.
Once we figured that out, okay, great, no problem. I have 3 chances to restart it, bleed the air out of the fuel lines so that it gets just straight fuel going into the generator. Let's restart it. Sounds good in theory, but over the next 4 hours, I would go through 1, 2, 3 shots of 3,000 PSI high pressure air. And on the last shot, the generator still didn't start. So now at about 7:30 Sunday morning, I'm sitting alongside the pier in Aden, hot, dark, quiet, without power, sinking because of a terrorist attack.
Ugh.
And I have no way to restart generator, get power to the ship. And the situation was assessed ashore by the Joint Task Force commander responding to the attack in 5th Fleet, that they actually contacted back to Washington, the National Military Command Center, notified the White House Situation Room. They woke the president up at 4:30 in the morning and said, Captain, the ship, or Mr. President, the ship's lost power. It's sinking. We don't think they can save it. And this is where the real backbone of American sailors comes to the fore.
Yep.
They never gave up. They dug in.
Yeah. What do you do? What?
Well, what we did at that point is God loves sailor ingenuity. Captain, what if we were to take the dewatering pumps, go down into the engine room, because we couldn't couple them in series at the time. Okay, we didn't have the equipment to do it. We do now on ships, thanks to coal, but we didn't have it at the time. So what do? We took the pumps down low into the engine room, and then we literally cut 2 holes in the side of the ship near the waterline. One for the discharge of the water and one for the exhaust. That got the pump started that would hold the flood waters steady at that point. The next thing we did is one of my sailors said, you know, the air packs that the firefighters wear? What if we took our portable pumps, put them on the flight deck, ran the hoses down to the flask for the high pressure air for the generator, jury-rigged the fittings, and used those portable pumps to give us the same type of high pressure air, but instead of filling a firefighter flask, we're filling the flask for the generator instead.
And try to start it again.
We did that for 14 hours. At 5 minutes after midnight on Monday morning, I had 2 shots of high pressure air, and on the first one, we restarted number 3 generator.
Damn. That's just incredible, the ingenuity side of it. You're right. I mean, battle tested.
Yep.
Amazing. Amazing.
So that's where we got the ship up, stable, steady, and then it was spending the next 17 days in port till we could get the heavy lift ship Blue Marlin into position 23 miles down the coast. And on the 29th of October, 17 days after we'd been attacked, we pulled the ship off the pier. I mandated complete silence because I knew the crew would hear if something was going wrong long before they saw it. And we got USS Cole underway and out there. And that really signified the resiliency that you saw in the crew. And that was that ability that despite the horrific nature of what had happened, despite the fact that we had to carry our sailors off the ship in a dignified, honors departure and remains transfer ceremony, we did that for them. And the crew bounced back. And, it really is a testament to how well they did it. And
God bless them.
I couldn't be more proud of them in what they accomplished during those 17 dark days that we were in port. But we would come home to the crew got a hero's welcome from the leadership of the Navy and the American people, and it was absolutely wonderful.
Now, and that is just, it's incredible. I want you to tell the part of the story that you talked about when we met about one of your officers had asked if at night, normally lower the colors. and bring the flags down. And
Sure.
instead, you did
Well,
what?
oh, yep. So at the end of the first, as we're coming up on sunset the first day, and Navy ships are just like a base. Every morning at 8 o'clock, we raise our flag to fly over the ship for the day. We play the national anthem while we're doing it. And then at sunset, calculated no matter where we are in the world, we lower the flag, hold it, and wait till the next morning to raise it. As we're coming up on sunset that first day, the XO and I are standing at the back of the flight deck. The ship's stable. The wounded are ashore. We know that people are coming to help us, but we were still on our own. And I'll never forget standing there, and the XO looks at me and says, "Captain, what do you want to do about colors? Do you want to hold it like we normally do to show that they haven't disrupted our routine? Do you want to lower it to half mast to honor the 17 sailors killed, 37 wounded? How do you want to deal with colors?" And I'll never forget looking at my XO
This
and then
is
looking
awesome.
up at that flag. And then I looked over at Aden. The lights were coming on in the twilight. And I turned back to the XO and said, "XO, we're not going to hold colors. I want that flag to fly at full mast. I want lights rigged to shine up on it
It's
as a
awesome.
symbol of our resolve that we are not going to let this terrorist attack deter us from our mission of defending freedom." And that flag would fly for the next 8 days until the last sailor had been located, pried out, and had begun that long journey home to their families. And on the 9th day, as we came on sunset, we held a memorial ceremony. Crew was seated on the flight deck on cots that had been brought on board for them to sleep on. We had all the support forces, FBI, NCIS, all the others that I mentioned before, watched over us. Our chaplain, who had come aboard now from the George Washington and the Mediterranean, he ministered to the crew that day, and as we approached sunset, he got up and gave the invocation. I spoke. Then a crew member from every rank that we'd lost spoke. Officer, chief petty officer, enlisted.
Oh,
then as a crew, we sang Amazing Grace.
God bless
and
you.
Sunset, we lowered the flag, folded it, and then we passed it down the line to 17 sailors, rendering that last final salute as we announced the name of every shipmate that we'd lost. And when it got to the end, my command master chief took the flag, presented it to me. I gave it to my relief, and that flag is now mounted on the mess decks of USS Cole, serving as a source of inspiration for those sailors serving aboard her today.
That's awesome. Terribly sad, but awesome. And then when you left port, so 19th day, you push off under power, and you picked a couple of musical selections to leave Aden,
well,
which I think is awesome too.
As USS Cole got underway from the pier and we started getting towed out of port, I turned to the XO, and the first song I told him to play was the Star Spangled Banner. I wanted that song echoing across the harbor to send a signal to the Yemenis people that despite what had happened to us, we were still going to leave with our head held high.
Yep.
And then as we passed the Yemeni patrol boat, and we rendered honors to each other for the crew that had come out in their dress uniforms to honor what we had accomplished.
Yep.
I turned to the XO and said, "Play the second song." And the second song that we played was the Star Spangled Banner again. But the second time we played that Star Spangled Banner, it was the Jimi Hendrix version.
I just think that is so awesome. Oh.
And I felt pretty good as the captain, and I said, "XO, crew's earned it. Let them play what they want." And I learned my most valuable lesson as a captain on just how much leash you give a sailor in a moment like this. Because the next song that they played isn't what I was defined as music, because they had turned everything up. It was just vibrating noise.
Yeah.
But the song they played was from a great American guy named Kid Rock. And what was the song? American Badass.
God, I'm just so doggone proud. I grew up a patriotic individual because of World War II parents, and my grandfather was World War I, and just uncles in Korea and family. I have a nephew now down in the nuclear propulsion program outside Charleston for the submarine and aircraft carrier program. It just makes me so proud to hear that. Just a great story.
Pretty awesome, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Now, so all of that, you saved the ship, you brought her back home. I want to touch on in our just last few minutes how, you had touched on before that terrorism, everybody thinks of 9/11, but it had been there forever. First of all, October 12th was very close to your heart. You lived it. You talked about Beirut, Hezbollah, Libyan, Gaddafi, those types of things. But you came back to the U.S. and were stationed, I believe, at the Pentagon. Is that correct?
I was, and I know where you're going, and I'll tell the story.
Okay.
One of the things that I will mention, though, when you talked about that terrorism being with us for a while, the reality is that USS Cole was fundamentally different than any other terrorist attack we had as a nation to that point. Because up until that point, let's face it, we had the Beirut barracks. We'd had the embassy bombing in Beirut, the Beirut barracks bombing.
Yep.
We had Kopar Towers, the embassy bombings in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya. But those are all things that house and represent U.S. interests around the world. Cole was different because USS Cole is something that defends our national security interests around the world. So when you try to take away a nation's ability to defend itself, it's an act of war.
Right. And
we, as a nation, missed that, unfortunately, until the 9/11 attacks occurred.
Yeah.
But if rewinding a little bit and going back in time, when I finished with USS Cole, I was assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in what they call the J5, the Strategy and Policy Directorate. I checked in there in July of 2001, and my commanding officer on the Aegis cruiser out of San Diego, USS Shiloh, contacted me and said, "Hey, I'm retired. I'm working up at the CIA now. My boss, a guy named Charlie Allen, would love to have you come up, and we would like to walk you through what we here at the agency knew about bin Laden before, during, and after the attack on your ship." Well, I thought, hey, this is a pretty cool opportunity.
Yeah,
I've never been to CIA headquarters before. So I got up in the morning, drove up there, after we fenced the date. Beautiful day. I talked to the nice camera at the gate. I talked to the nice armed guard when the gate goes down.
Yeah.
I was kind of spoiled. They gave me a pass to park in the VIP parking in front of the old headquarters building. I walk in, and there's the huge granite seal on the floor.
Oh, yeah.
16 foot in diameter. And to the left, there is one gold star on the wall. And that was for all those who gave their lives in the service with the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA.
Yeah.
And to my right is the row after row of gold stars for the CIA. And I walk in, John and I grab a cup of coffee, we chat for a few minutes, and then we go in and we talk. And they essentially briefed me. They had to dumb it down a little bit because getting a security clearance with the agency is a very big deal, and I had not gone through that process.
Yep.
But nonetheless, they did share with me a lot of highly sensitive and classified information about bin Laden. And at the end, Mr. Allen looks at me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, first, sir, thank you very much. I know how valuable your time is. We've been at this for an hour and a half, but I got to be honest with you, sir. America doesn't understand. I believe it is going to take a seminal event, probably in this country, where hundreds, if not thousands, die before Americans realize we're at war with this guy,
wake up.
Meaning bin Laden."
Yep.
And he said, "Well, we're doing our best to make sure that doesn't happen." And at that point, we broke up in the meeting. We went out. They wanted me to look at some overhead imagery or satellite pictures of areas in Afghanistan like Tarnak Farms, which is a major Al-Qaeda training camp. 20 minutes after I said that,
This is unbelievable.
The first plane struck the North Tower. It was the morning of 9/11.
Don't you wish you didn't have this? And it's not psychic powers, I guess, but man, I wish you were. I know no one wishes they were wrong more than you do that day.
In many ways, I felt terribly guilty because I looked at it and said, "You've known about the dangers of this guy for a year. Why haven't you been speaking out? Why haven't you been doing more? Why have you failed your nation yet again? Why are more people going to die?"
Yeah.
And, I know that there's nothing I could have done to prevent that attack. But, you always have that guilt when you serve your nation that
Sure.
you want to defend it always and in any way
And
you can.
forever, and never allow anything bad to
Yep.
happen to it.
And at that point, I got in the car. We said our farewells and goodbyes. And I drove down to the Pentagon. And as I'm approaching the Pentagon, I'm on the phone, and I was told
unbelievable.
The Pentagon's been attacked. And I said, yep, I could see the top of the black cloud coming up where the plane had impacted. And I would end up driving out onto what they call Highway 395, which is the main artery out of Washington, D.C., headed south.
Yeah.
And as I'm standing up there directing traffic, getting people loaded on buses, overseeing, seeing some of the evacuation out of the Pentagon, and getting parents calmed down because their kids had been evacuated out of the daycare center attached to the Pentagon. Twice I'd have these big black Suburbans with flashing blue lights drive up, slam on their brakes, back up. Windows had rolled down. And it was FBI agents responding out of headquarters downtown D.C. that looked at me and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'm like, it was guys that had been on board coal with me that recognized me.
Oh, wow.
And I just looked at them and said, "Hey, I'm just doing what I can to direct traffic." And they said, "Can't you get away from these guys?" And I say, "Hey, stick close. They're at least missing me still."
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, God bless you all. Just amazing story. And I really appreciate you sharing this. And I know you're asked a lot on it, and I don't know what type of traumatic stress that put you through, what it took for you to be able to have sleep at night, again, come into your life, the type of effects it's had on your family. But on behalf of all Americans, anybody I know that listens to the show anyway, God bless you, and we greatly appreciate your service and all of the service of those on your crews and that serve today. And our thoughts and prayers are for all of those that we lost, those that we will lose. This battle is going to go on forever. It's never going to be over, because extremism hides in the crevices and the shadows of this world, and it's just really unfortunate. But to kind of finish up, do you have any final words or observations that you want to share with the crowd here about your experience or what's going on in anything today? Is there anything that you want to make sure you got across today?
Well, the main thing I would say is that, we are living in very tenuous and in many ways dangerous times. Mm-hmm. And we as a nation over the next few years are going to be challenged in ways that we have not seen since pre-World War II. And especially now in a globally connected society, there are going to be a lot of pressure for us not to prepare for what may be a looming conflict, whether it is with China or Russia or Iran. And at the end of the day, I just go back to what we had with President Reagan. And that is, you can have peace, but the only way you will have that with credibility is through strength.
Yep.
And so consequently, we are going to have to maybe do more with less in order to allow us to have the kind of robust economy, have the kind of robust military that has the defense, and not just the capacity, but also the political will and credibility that when challenged, we can respond swiftly and decisively, and make sure that people understand that if you go to challenge and hamper or destroy our national security interests, we will respond. And I don't think we should respond commensurately anymore.
You wipe it out.
We should make these countries pay a price.
Yep. It's the only way. And those that, pacifists and things of that nature, it's great on paper. Just like communism and socialism. It's great on paper, but it doesn't work. They only
Karl
understand
Marx
it.
Great in what he put out. Unfortunately, there's a thing called human nature that keeps,
evil takes over, and it all becomes about power.
Yeah,
that's right.
They're never that idyllic world
does not exist. That's right, because humans are humans, and it's 0 and 100. It's not 0 and 3. It's 0 and 100. communism and socialism. Socialism, the longest it's lasted is 6 months in the last, 80 years. It's an amazing. People need to use their intellect instead of their emotions in some of these things, and the intellect uses data and experience and history because it will repeat itself.
Yep. Unfortunately, you're right.
Kirk, I cannot say thank you enough. This means so much to me. First of all, you've been such a gracious man to me to agree to come on this little bitty show, guy named Brent, and to share your story with the listeners. It is so appreciated. I hope that we can stay in contact. And again, I want to push out to everybody. It's Lippold Strategies, and you got to read this book. It's called Front Burner. It's Al-Qaeda's Attack on the USS Cole by Commander Lippold. It's a great read. As you can tell from the story, it's just awe-inspiring. It pulls you in, and the details and the level of description and leading up to it and post-story is just amazing. So get the book, check it out. Kirk, I thank you so very much, sir. I hope you have a wonderful Father's Day and a weekend to relax and reset. And God bless you. I appreciate you. You're an American hero. Thank you.